Under the harsh sun of a crowded Roman marketplace, a line of men, women, and children stands half naked on a wooden platform, each with a tablet around their neck listing age and skills. A mother's outstretched arms tremble as her young child is torn from her side. They are sold separately to different buyers, their desperate cries lost in the din of the auction. 2,000 years later, on an auction block in New Orleans, enslaved African-American families huddled together, surrounded by onlookers and bidders. One by one, they're led forward and sold to the highest bidder. Children go one way, parents another. A husband is dragged off while his wife begs through tears. Both settings expose the same brutal transaction. People reduced to property, sold without mercy or regard. Though separated by centuries, the cruelty in these systems ran deep. Yet Roman slavery and American slavery, despite their horrific similarities, were not quite the same. In this video, we'll be going deep into the differences of how these two slave systems worked, how they began, how the enslaved lived and labored, and how violence held it all together. But before we begin, we encourage you to subscribe. History, especially the parts soaked in pain, often gets simplified or buried. But the people who lived through it, who endured what should never have been asked of them, deserve better than silence or half-truths. If you believe that the past should be faced with honesty and that those who suffered under it should not be forgotten, then this is a space for you. Now let's begin our journey into the darkest chapters of human history, comparing two of the most infamous slave societies across time. The origins and foundations of slavery in Rome and in the American South were actually profoundly different, rooted in different eras and ideologies. Slavery in ancient Rome was as old as the Republic itself, an accepted fact of life woven into the fabric of society. It expanded as Rome expanded, fed by the conquest of foreign peoples. When Roman legions triumphed, prisoners of war were routinely enslaved and shipped back to Italy to be sold in markets. Entire populations of conquered towns could be taken in chains, a grim human bounty of empire. A person might also be enslaved for other reasons. One could be born into slavery if your mother was a slave, or you might even be exposed as an infant and then raised as a slave by whoever rescued you. Kidnapping and piracy put unlucky travelers on the auction block. There were cases of desperate Roman citizens selling themselves into slavery to pay off debts, a practice that, while not common, was legal in certain periods. In short, almost anyone in the ancient Mediterranean world, regardless of ethnicity or background, could end up wearing the chains of servitude if circumstances turned against them. By contrast, American slavery, particularly as it developed in the British colonies and later the United States, had a much narrower gateway. It was essentially a hereditary racial caste. From the late 1600s onward, colonial laws made clear that all African-descended people in certain colonies could be presumed slaves unless proven otherwise, and that the status of slavery was inherited from one's mother. If you were a black person in the southern states in the 18th or early 19th century, that alone could seal your fate. The transatlantic slave trade violently funneled millions of Africans into New World slavery, people captured in the African interior or sold by other Africans to European traders, chained in horrific ship holds and transported across the ocean. Those who survived the Middle Passage were sold in the Americas as chattel. Unlike Roman slavery, being of a certain race was essentially the sole route into bondage in the Americas. No white person in the American South, no matter how poor, feared being legally enslaved. The institution was deliberately and aggressively tied to blackness. Indigenous peoples were also sometimes enslaved in earlier colonial days, but by the 19th century, American slavery was almost entirely the enslavement of black people. This racial definition had profound effects. In Rome, slaves were certainly despised as an underclass, but they were not viewed as subhuman due to skin color. A slave in Rome was still a human being in the eyes of society, albeit a person in chains. In the American South, enslaved Africans were often depicted by pro-slavery ideologues as innately inferior, even not fully human. Pseudo-scientific racism took root, with slave owners arguing that people of African ancestry were somehow suited or destined for servitude. This helped them justify what was otherwise a glaring contradiction in a new nation that proclaimed freedom and equality. Southern slave owners and politicians infamously claimed that slavery was a positive good for black people, a paternalistic lie used to excuse exploitation. The venom of racial ideology thus became a unique hallmark of American slavery, whereas Roman slavery, abhorrent as it was, did not typically rest on an idea that one particular race was born to be slaves. Roman writers certainly expressed ethnocentric biases and stereotypes, but the concept of race-based chattel slavery in the modern sense was absent. Economically and socially, the two systems also arose in different contexts. Ancient Rome was a pre-industrial agrarian empire. Slavery was the economic engine that powered everything from agriculture to mining to domestic service. There was no machinery, no modern industry. Human muscle was the main source of large-scale labor. The Romans could imagine no alternative to using slave labor on massive scales. In the United States, however, slavery took root in a world that was changing rapidly. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the seeds of industrial capitalism were sprouting. Factories powered by wage labor, not slave labor, were proving productive in the North and in Europe. The British Empire, once a major slave trading power, outlawed the slave trade in 1807 and abolished slavery in the 1830s, pressuring the moral consciousness of the West. Abolitionist movements, often grounded in Enlightenment ideals and Christian morality, were growing louder. Southern slaveholders became increasingly anxious and defensive as they realized the world was turning against the institution of slavery. Unlike the Romans, who lived in a world where slavery was ubiquitous and unquestioned, American enslavers operated in an era where freedom was loudly celebrated and slavery was coming under moral fire. This helps explain why American slave owners were generally far less willing to voluntarily free their slaves than Roman masters often were. They feared, perhaps correctly, that any crack in the system could lead to its collapse. But despite these differences in context, Roman and American slavery shared a grim core reality. People were treated as property. In both societies, slaves were legally chattel, meaning they could be bought, sold, gifted, or disposed of at an owner's whim. Roman legal texts classified slaves as res mancipi, literally property akin to land or cattle. In the American legal system, the same dehumanization was codified. Nowhere was this more starkly stated than in the 1857 U.S. Supreme Court decision, Dred Scott versus Sanford, where Chief Justice Roger Taney wrote that African Americans, enslaved or free, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the black man could be reduced to slavery for his benefit and treated as mere property that could be bought and sold. From these foundations, each slave system developed its own unique character. Let's now step further into the lives of the enslaved and the day-to-day realities of Roman versus American slavery. How did the experience of being a slave differ under the Roman eagle and under the stars and stripes? What was life really like for those unfortunate souls condemned to bondage in these two worlds? Dawn breaks over a Roman villa in the Italian countryside. In the slave barracks behind the main house, shackled workers stir from a fitful sleep on straw mats. A chain gang of field slaves is roused and marched out by an overseer to begin another day of backbreaking labor on the estate's wheat fields and vineyards. Many shuffle slowly, iron fetters clanking on their ankles. Their diet is meager, their bodies exhausted, and they know that any sign of slacking could invite a lashing. Meanwhile, in the villa's kitchen, a Greek slave cook is already stoking the fires to bake bread for the household. In the front courtyard, a tutor, himself an educated slave from Syria, waits to escort the master's children to their lessons. Elsewhere, a gladiator slave, prized for his strength, trains for an upcoming fight, perhaps eating better than other slaves, but knowing he may die for spectators' amusement. This was the world of Roman slavery, incredibly diverse in the roles slaves performed, yet uniformly built on coercion and fear. If you visited a Roman city or villa, you might encounter enslaved people in dozens of different occupations. They ranged from the lowliest to the most skilled: farmers, miners, gladiators, household servants, cooks, cleaners, litter bearers, secretaries, accountants, teachers, midwives, artisans, actors, even managers of their masters' businesses. It is jarring to modern sensibilities, but in Rome, One could be treated by a doctor who was a slave, watch a play starring an actor who was a slave, or have one's finances managed by a slave accountant. Slaves in ancient Rome truly did what we regard as high-status jobs, alongside all the menial ones. In the American South, the daily life of enslaved people was more uniformly grim in its simplicity. Most enslaved African Americans were agricultural laborers, forced to work on plantations and farms cultivating crops like cotton, tobacco, rice, and sugar. A typical day on a southern plantation might begin well before sunrise, with the enslaved men and women stumbling out of their wooden cabins, crude shacks with dirt floors in many cases, at the sound of a horn or bell. By first light, they would already be in the fields, hoes and sacks in hand. Under the watchful eye of an overseer, who often carried a whip, they toiled in the sweltering heat, plowing, planting, chopping weeds, and by late summer, painstakingly picking cotton bolls or cutting sugarcane. There was little variety in these tasks. Day in, day out, it was agricultural drudgery on an exhausting schedule. Unlike Rome, where an enslaved person might be a tutor one day and a clerk the next, in the American South, the enslaved were overwhelmingly used as field hands or domestic servants. It would have been unthinkable in early 19th century Virginia for a white family to consult an enslaved black doctor or banker. Slaves in America were deliberately kept uneducated and relegated to menial agrarian roles on the plantations. Society imposed a rigid limit on what jobs an enslaved person could do, primarily hard labor. A small minority worked as house servants, cooks, blacksmiths, or coach drivers, roles considered more skilled or trustworthy, but even these were within the confines of serving the plantation economy and white households. The living conditions for enslaved people reflected their status as property in both societies, though again, there were differences in degree and style. On a Roman agricultural estate, field slaves might be housed in ergastula, essentially prison-like barracks, sometimes even underground, where they were chained at night to prevent escape. They slept in overcrowded, dirty quarters, and their diet was basic: grain, olives, maybe scraps of salted fish, or leftover meat on occasion. Farm slaves were often kept constantly shackled, working with chains around their feet. These unfortunate souls, many of them war captives from far-off lands, were treated as expendable consumer goods who worked till death in the fields or mines. The concept of working a slave to death was not unusual to Roman owners. If a slave died of exhaustion or abuse, the master would simply buy another to replace them. In the American South, plantation slaves also endured extremely harsh conditions, but owners had a financial incentive to keep them alive and productive, at least until the cotton was picked and the women had born children. Enslaved people typically lived in small shacks or cabins in an area of the plantation called the slave quarters. These cabins were crude one-room huts made of wood or logs, often without windows or with just a small opening and with roofs that leaked in the rain. Multiple people, sometimes an entire family, might share one cramped cabin. They slept on rudimentary beds or pallets, much like their Roman counterparts. Diet was likewise monotonous. Weekly rations of cornmeal, pork fat or salt pork, and maybe some molasses, supplemented by vegetables they cultivated in tiny garden plots by their quarters. Many enslaved people in America were hungry much of the time, just like the underfed Roman slaves. Both Roman and American slaveholders were notorious for giving the bare minimum of food and rest needed to keep their investment alive and working. Punishments and control methods in the two systems also offer a window into their daily lives. The Roman slave owner wielded virtually unchecked power over his slaves. A Roman master could beat, torture, or even kill a slave with little fear of legal consequences in the early eras. Whippings were common for any perceived disobedience or slacking. Some Roman masters were even known for extreme cruelty, the stuff of nightmares. Historical anecdotes tell of a wealthy Roman who threw slaves to his moray eels for minor mistakes, literally using human beings as fish food. Another infamous incident, when one Roman aristocrat was murdered by a household slave, the law demanded collective punishment. All 400 of his slaves were executed in retaliation, including women and children, despite public outcry. Such was the terror that hung over enslaved people in Rome, the knowledge that torture or gruesome death could be a moment's whim away. American slavery, too, was enforced by brutal violence. The whip was perhaps the defining symbol of the plantation master's authority. Enslaved people lived with the constant threat of a whipping for any infraction. Working too slowly, talking back, or sometimes no reason at all beyond an overseer's sadistic pleasure. The lashes often left permanent scars. One famous 1863 photograph of a man named Peter shows his back grotesquely covered in keloid scars from countless beatings, a testament to the torture he endured in bondage. Beyond whipping, enslaved people in the U.S. could be shackled or put in iron collars as punishment. There are accounts of slaves made to wear an iron muzzle or mask and heavy collar, a device that not only choked and terrorized them, but also prevented them from eating crops in the field or speaking freely. Owners used other cruel methods, like chaining people in stress positions or forcing them to wear bells so they could not move quietly. In extreme cases, slaves who attacked whites or led rebellions were executed, sometimes in gruesome ways, hanged, burned alive, or dismembered as a warning to others. The law in southern states technically considered the murder of a slave by an owner a crime by the 19th century, but it was rarely enforced as long as the owner claimed it was a form of discipline. In practice, much like in Rome, an American enslaver could kill or maim a slave with little consequence, a fact which struck fear into the hearts of the enslaved. Both societies kept their slaves in check through a combination of violence and psychological terror. However, daily life was not solely defined by suffering. It was also shaped by how enslaved people coped and the small spaces of humanity they carved out. In the Roman context, slaves who were in household or urban settings sometimes formed friendships, romantic relationships, even families. An educated household slave might snatch moments to read or write for personal solace. A group of kitchen slaves might sing traditional songs from their homeland as they cooked, keeping their culture alive in a foreign land. Similarly, on American plantations, enslaved African Americans developed a rich subculture in the shadows of the plantation regime. In their slave quarters at night, somewhat removed from white oversight, they told stories, sang spirituals and work songs, practiced their faith, and supported one another as family. They snatched brief moments of rest on Saturday nights or Sundays to hold prayer meetings, share news, or simply be together without the overseer's whip at their backs. In those quarters, parents lovingly raised children, knowing painfully that those children might be taken away. Couples married in their own ceremonies, like the tradition of jumping the broom, since their marriages had no standing in law. And people laughed, cried, dreamed, asserting their humanity in a world determined to deny it. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of daily life under both systems was the fragility of family bonds. Neither Roman nor American slavery respected the sanctity of family among the enslaved. In Rome, as noted, slave mothers had no legal claim over their children. A baby born to an enslaved woman was the property of her master from birth. The master could, and often did, sell the child for profit or to punish the mother. Mothers were frequently forced to hand over infants to be raised elsewhere, or the children were trained for service as soon as they could walk. In American slavery, likewise, the slave trader's philosophy was to treat people like livestock, selling individual units without regard to family ties. A slave owner in debt might decide to sell a husband but not the wife, or children but not the mother. Historians estimate that around 1/3 of enslaved children in upper South states like Virginia were separated from a parent by sale at some point. The ever-present knowledge of this possibility cast a shadow over every joy. A father holding his newborn son knew that that child could be sold down the river to Mississippi in a few years. A wife kissing her husband goodnight always feared that by dawn, an order of sale could tear him away forever. The trauma of family separation was a wound that cut deep in both regimes, a source of profound emotional agony that enslaved people had to somehow endure on top of all the physical hardships. Now, if daily life for the enslaved was filled with toil and torment, what of the possibility of escaping that life? To answer that, we must also consider how the enslaved themselves took matters into their own hands to resist and seek freedom when they could. From the moment a human is held in bondage, the instinct to resist flickers within. In both Roman and American slave systems, enslaved people found ways great and small, to push back against dehumanization. Some acts were subtle, a stolen moment of rest, a tool accidentally broken, a secret literacy lesson by candlelight. But at times, desperation and hope converged into open revolt. The scale and outcomes of slave resistance, however, differed notably between ancient Rome and the antebellum United States. In the long history of Roman slavery, the most dramatic resistance came in the form of the Servile Wars, 3 major slave uprisings in the late Republic. The largest and most legendary of these was the rebellion led by Spartacus in 73 to 71 BCE. Spartacus was a Thracian gladiator who, with a small band of comrades, escaped a gladiator training school and took refuge on Mount Vesuvius. What began as a ragtag flight for freedom swelled into a formidable army of enslaved people seeking liberation. Over 2 years, Spartacus's forces defeated multiple Roman detachments, terrorizing the Roman elite who had complacently assumed slaves could never challenge them. The Roman Senate had to dispatch legion after legion. Even then, Spartacus outmaneuvered them several times. It took one of Rome's richest men, Marcus Licinius Crassus, leading a well-trained army of perhaps 40,000 to finally corner and crush the rebellion. The aftermath was brutal. Crassus crucified 6,000 captured rebel slaves along the Appian Way from Capua to Rome as a gruesome warning. For miles, crosses lined the road, each bearing a dying slave. This iconic revolt, though ultimately unsuccessful, shocked the Roman Republic. It proved that slaves were not always passive, that they could organize and fight fiercely for freedom. Earlier, 2 significant revolts in Sicily had likewise required military force to suppress. Yet after Spartacus's defeat, and especially as the empire period progressed, no slave uprising on that massive scale would occur again in Roman history. Rome's sheer military might, combined with tactics like scattering slaves of the same origin and keeping them divided, helped prevent large-scale coordination. The fear of rebellion always loomed, however. Masters feared the shadow of Spartacus in their own villas. This was one reason why they were against having slaves who all spoke the same language or came from the same region. They worried those slaves might organize and rebel if they could easily communicate. In the American South, slave revolts also occurred, but none reached the size or military success of Spartacus's war. The demographics and context were different. In most parts of the South, enslaved blacks were a large minority, but not the majority. They were unarmed and faced the surveillance of not only planters, but an organized system of slave patrols and militias ready to snuff out resistance. Still, the desire for freedom was indomitable, and a few notable rebellions broke out. The earliest large revolt in colonial America was the Stono Rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina, where a group of enslaved men, some likely from the Kingdom of Congo in Africa, took up arms, killed several white colonists, and attempted to march towards Spanish Florida, where freedom was promised to escaped British slaves. They were intercepted and defeated, and harsh reprisals followed. Other planned revolts were foiled before they could materialize, such as Gabriel Prosser's intended uprising in Richmond in 1800 and Denmark Vesey's conspiracy in Charleston in 1822. These plots involved potentially hundreds of slaves ready to rise, but informants leaked them and the leaders were hanged before the plan could unfold. But the most famous actual rebellion in U.S. history was Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. Nat Turner, an enslaved preacher in Virginia, believed God had called him to strike against the slave owners. One August night, he and a small band of slaves went from house to house in Southampton County, Virginia, killing slave-holding families in their sleep. By the next day, they had killed around 55 white people, including women and children. Turner hoped to gather a larger army of enslaved people as they went, but within 2 days, local militia and armed white citizens overwhelmed the rebels. Turner was captured after 2 months in hiding and executed, along with roughly 50 other slaves who were found complicit. In the hysterical aftermath, white mobs and militias killed perhaps over 100 black people indiscriminately, many of whom had nothing to do with the rebellion. The Nat Turner revolt affected the South far out of proportion to its size. It terrified slaveholders much as news of Spartacus had once terrified Roman nobles. In effect, each hint of rebellion led to a tightening of the chains and stricter controls. Thus, large-scale armed rebellions in the American South were relatively few and were often defeated swiftly. There was no American equivalent of Spartacus leading legions of slaves in open battle for years. One reason is the balance of power. By the 19th century, the southern states had well-organized militias and communications. Any uprising in one county could quickly be met with forces from others. Additionally, enslaved Americans had limited access to weapons or training. In Rome's Republican era, by contrast, slaves were sometimes trained as gladiators, giving them combat skills, as with Spartacus and his fellows, and the chaos of constant wars provided more opportunity for masses of captives to coordinate a breakout. Another difference is geography. Spartacus had the open expanse of Italy to maneuver in and even hope to escape over the Alps. Enslaved Americans were mostly hemmed in by the reach of U.S. law. Fleeing north was possible for individuals, but raising an army and holding territory was nearly impossible in the face of state and federal firepower. That said, resistance did not only mean rebellion. In both slave systems, running away was a persistent form of resistance. Countless Roman slaves attempted to escape their masters. In the countryside, fugitive slaves sometimes banded together as bandits in the hills. One could try to disappear into the anonymity of a city, though Rome had a whole profession of slave catchers and informants. Runaways were such a common issue that many wore collars or had tattoos identifying them for return. Rome had laws offering rewards for capturing runaways and imposing harsh penalties on those captured. In the American South, running away was equally, if not more, common, but the distances and dangers were different. Some enslaved people fled to free northern states or Canada, making use of secret networks later called the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman, an escaped slave herself, became a famed conductor on this railroad, returning to the South some 13 times and leading around 70 slaves to freedom over the years. Her courage, evading slave catchers and armed posses, often with a pistol in one hand and faith in the other, made her a legend. But she was the exception. For most enslaved people, running was a desperately perilous gamble. Those caught faced brutal punishment. Whipping was certain, and many owners would brutalize the runaway in front of others to set an example. Some runaways, like a man named Charles Nall who reached the North, were captured and nearly dragged back, only to be rescued by crowds of abolitionist allies at great risk. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 even compelled Northern citizens to help catch runaways, making escape to free states more fraught. Despite these obstacles, the desire for liberty drove many to flee. It's estimated that tens of thousands escaped to freedom in the 1850s alone, especially once the Civil War began and chaos gave cover to runaways. Slaves in America also resisted in everyday ways: sabotage, slowdowns, feigning illness, and maintaining their cultural traditions against the owner's will. They might break tools to disrupt work, set fire to a barn, or secretly harbor a fugitive. They formed familial bonds and kinship networks that weren't easily broken. Even something like teaching oneself to read, as Frederick Douglass did in secret as a boy, was an act of rebellion, a claim to intellectual self-ownership. In Rome, similar subtle resistance occurred: stealing from the master, working slowly, or pretending not to understand orders. Ultimately, the cumulative effect of countless acts of resistance, along with external pressures, would bring both systems of slavery to an end. Indeed, every empire and institution has its end. Roman slavery did not terminate in a single glorious moment of emancipation. It withered away over time as the world that sustained it changed. By the later years of the Roman Empire, the supply of slaves was dwindling. Rome was no longer conquering new territories as aggressively, and Christianity's spread introduced moral qualms about enslaving fellow believers. Economic changes meant that large estate owners found it useful to switch from slaves to a system of tenant farming. In this system, known as colony, formerly free poor people, and perhaps some slaves too, were tied to the land, working it in exchange for protection, and gradually the lines between slave and free labor blurred. It wasn't that Romans held a grand abolitionist debate or passed a law freeing all slaves. They did not. Instead, the institution of Roman slavery was brutal, and it persisted until it basically transformed during late antiquity into a new form of servitude. Around AD 533, the Emperor Justinian codified Roman law, and slavery was still part of it, yet by then the number of slaves was far smaller than in the days of the Republic. The Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, long before Justinian, and in those chaotic final years, many big estates couldn't get new slaves and thus treated the ones they had more like serfs, or their slaves simply ran off amid the turmoil. One could say Roman slavery died not with a bang, but a whimper. It was never officially abolished, but as the empire decayed, slavery as a system receded and gave way to the peasant serf class in Europe. In Rome, there was no equivalent of an Emancipation Proclamation or 13th Amendment. The end came through a complex socio-economic evolution rather than a moral reckoning. In the United States, the abolition of slavery was astoundingly abrupt by comparison and utterly transformative. By the mid-19th century, the country was tearing apart over the issue. The northern states, where slavery was not integral to the economy, had all abolished slavery or were on the path to doing so by the early 1800s, leading to a growing free black population there. The southern states, on the other hand, doubled down on slavery, especially with the rise of cotton after 1800. Technology like the cotton gin made slave-grown cotton immensely profitable, fueling 75% of the world's cotton supply by 1860 and making many southern planters very wealthy. This economic incentive made southern elites fiercely resistant to any talk of abolition. The tension over new territories being slave or free and the very moral legitimacy of slavery led to national political crises. Finally, in 1861, 11 southern states seceded from the Union to form the Confederacy explicitly to preserve slavery. The Civil War that ensued, the bloodiest conflict in American history, was fundamentally about whether slavery would continue or be extinguished. During the war, enslaved people themselves took bold action. As Union armies approached, hundreds of thousands of slaves fled their plantations and sought refuge with Union forces. These contrabands, as they were called, pressured the Union to make emancipation a war aim. President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 declared all slaves in Confederate-controlled areas to be free. Enslaved men by the tens of thousands joined the Union Army after 1863, fighting for the freedom of their people. By war's end in 1865, the Confederacy was defeated, and the United States formally abolished slavery with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which declared that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. Nearly 4 million African Americans emerged from bondage as free people virtually overnight. The immediate aftermath in America was euphoric for the freed people. There were parades, mass meetings where formerly enslaved people celebrated and heard readings of the new laws. Yet this hard-won freedom was also precarious. The Southern white society, having lost the war, quickly set about reasserting dominance through black codes, sharecropping systems, and eventually Jim Crow laws that imposed a kind of quasi-servitude and disenfranchisement on African Americans. The legacy of slavery, particularly the ideology of racism that underpinned it, lived on in cruel ways. Former slaves in the U.S. enjoyed full freedom only briefly during Reconstruction. Soon, many were economically coerced into sharecropping contracts not unlike servitude, and violent groups like the KKK arose to terrorize them. So in essence, while American slavery ended decisively in a legal sense, its after effects continued to warp the nation's politics and social fabric for generations. Roman society's legacy of slavery was different. Because Roman slaves had been of all ethnic origins and their descendants blended into the population after manumission, there was no visible underclass identifiable by skin color in later centuries stemming solely from slavery. When Roman slavery faded, the concept of serfdom took over in Europe, a system also oppressive, but based on social class rather than the ownership of an individual outright. In the long run, Europeans kind of forgot about the slaves of Rome as a distinct group. They became absorbed into the general population or remained only as a historical memory. In contrast, American slavery left a distinct legacy of racial division. The freed African American population and their descendants remained a clearly identifiable group because American society made black a rigid category and were treated as second-class citizens well into the 20th century. The psychological and cultural impact of centuries of slavery is something the United States is still grappling with today. No one in Italy today is viewed a certain way because your ancestors were slaves in the Roman Empire. But in the US, the fact that someone's ancestors were enslaved often correlates with present disparities in wealth, health, and social outcomes. The echoes of slavery in America are tragically long and loud. The endings of these two systems show how different they were. Roman slavery ended because Rome itself transformed and fell. It was not a moral repudiation, but a historical transition. American slavery ended because human ideals of freedom triumphed in a bloody conflict, a conscious decision that slavery as an institution was wrong and had to be destroyed. When Roman slaves were freed individually, they often took on their former master's family name and continued in society with that tie. When American slaves were freed, they took new last names of their own choosing or their old master's name. But many, like Frederick Douglass, explicitly rejected any lingering ownership. Douglass chose a new surname to mark a new identity. With all of that said, the story of Roman versus American slavery is a tale of two slave societies with distinct values and structures, but a shared capacity for human cruelty. One relied on conquest, the other on race. One offered scattered paths to freedom, the other chained generations in hereditary bondage. Yet both systems depended on the same foundation: the total erasure of a person's rights, identity, and autonomy in service of wealth and power. By learning about these differences and similarities, we not only gain knowledge, we also hopefully gain wisdom and a renewed commitment to valuing freedom and human dignity for all people in all times. If this resonated with you, hit the like button. It helps more people find stories like this. Subscribe for more videos exploring history's harshest truths, and keep the conversation going by sharing your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay curious, stay human.